Okay, I think that is the cue for me to start. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all very much for attending and participating in this webinar. I want to just first start off by saying the Eno Center for Transportation. We are an independent nonprofit think tank dedicated to advancing transportation policy and professional development in the transportation space. Today's webinar will be regarding based on an earlier report this year that Eno released on the freight rail network. And this paper was specifically looking at the current state of the freight rail network, specifically examining efficiency and resilience and recommendations to improve efficiency and resiliency in the freight rail network, and then having this conversation in the context of looking at rail as a competitive mode within the transportation space and opportunities for even mode shift towards rail. And so in this webinar, we want to have a discussion with a number of rail experts, which I'll introduce in a moment, and kind of dive deeper into these concepts of rail efficiency and resilience and the general opportunities for rail as a competitive mode. And so I want to kind of go over some kind of format for the webinar. I will be co-moderating with my friend Henry Posner, and basically we'll go back and forth, ask some questions. And before that, I want to introduce our panelists. We will have Chuck Baker, who is the president of the American Shortline and Regional Railroad Association, and Luisa Fernandez-Willey, principal economist at Canadian National. And so before we kind of jump into our questions, I want to first give an opportunity to Chuck and Luisa to introduce themselves, tell us what they do, and then also kind of to start off the conversation, give us your take on what efficiency and resilience in the freight rail sector means to you, and what kind of opportunities there are for rail going forward. And then Henry and I will jump into some questions. And then following that, we will open up to the audience for their questions.
Sure.
And Chuck, why don't we start with you? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I went on alphabetical order at the very least.
Nice.
Well, let me start first by thanking Eno for the opportunity to do this. Thank you, Sahil and Henry, for kind of co-moderating. Henry is a legend in the freight rail world and the short line world in particular. So honor for me to be on a webinar with him. And Eno, I've loved Eno for a long time. Jeff Davis, I was a loyal Jeff Davis reader long before he was at Eno, but Eno's a great place, a true nonpartisan operation, which is, there's lots of think tanks that claim they're nonpartisan. Eno, I think, is one of the few that's actually true. And it's a real source of truth that for me and a lot of people I work with on transportation issues. So like Sahil said, I'm president of the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association. So that's the trade association for short line railroads. Hopefully, if you're on this webinar, you basically know what a short line railroad is, but like the 20-second version, let's call it, is these are the small freight railroads in the United States, largely kind of branch lines and feeder lines into the larger class 1 freight rail network. That's not always true. You know, there's 600 short line railroads, and if you know one, you know one. There are 600 unique stories, like Henry's short line railroad in Iowa looks very different than, you know, a small short line switching operation in New Jersey, and looks very different than a port operation in Florida, and looks very different than a, you know, like there's lots of examples, but in general, that's kind of what short lines are. And I get the privilege of representing them in DC, and they're kind of your small, scrappy, friendly, hungry, like local railroads. And I probably shouldn't brag about this in front of my bosses, including Henry, but I do have one of the easier jobs in DC, you know, getting to represent short line railroads, because people tend to like short line railroads, and they like them, you know, not because of me or because the association does, but because of what the short lines themselves do. They're extremely responsive to their customers. They're friendly. They pick up the phone. The answer is yes, and then they figure out how to do it later. They're very hungry for volume, and so the customers like them, the communities like them, the regulators like them, Congress likes them, so it sort of makes my job pretty easy, and I get to sort of tell the story. And I'll leave it at that for now, and we can get more into details and resilience and policy priorities and all that as we go.
Wow, let me see if I can follow that. So so I'm very pleased to be here, especially because I get to hang out with Henry and Chuck. So CN, well, for me, I'm the principal economist at CN, and I'm primarily responsible for leading the economics and insights team. And I primarily monitor key metrics and trends that are affecting the movement of commodities across all North America. And I'm also oversee Mexican regulatory matters. So it's a super exciting job. And we love working with our short lines. In fact, we hosted a big short-line conference earlier this year up in Montreal, and Chuck was there, and so was Henry. And so CN is one of the Class 1 railroads. We have about 20,000 mile route network, and we have access to 3 different coasts, and we operate actually in 15 states. And part of what Chuck said is about working with other carriers. We work very closely with the short lines, and through that, we actually have access to 48 states in the US. So we operate in 15, but through these partnerships, we're able to have more access. And he's right about the relationship with the shorelands. They're friendly. It's like a family when we get together, and like the nice cousins that you hang out with. And it's always like a really nice vibe when you talk to the shorelands. So hashtag we love the short lines. There you go. So I can dive in first on the question on the, with the increase of freight demand by 2020, was it about 2050? And then, how do we prioritize this private partnerships to maximize, efficiency and rail? And as I was kind of pondering over this question, I was kind of thinking about, from the perspective of a Class 1 railroad, the answer has to be, targeted, collaborative. These investments have to deliver economic and environmental benefits. So, as you think about that, it should probably include things like, truck to rail conversion, modal flexibility, and regional economic development and job creation opportunities. So one of the examples that I wanted to provide you is, a very compelling example from CN, and this is a new transload facility in Michigan, in Flat Rock, Michigan, which was developed in partnership with Target Steel and the state of Michigan's Freight Economic Development Program. So what we did is, we had this 20-foot square footage transload facility, and the Target Steel was able to shift about, significant amount of steel coil from truck to rail. And when you think about what this modal shift means is, you're taking hundreds of heavy trucks removed from the highways, and if you think about it, rail only contributes about 2% of transportation related emissions, whereas trucking is about 24%. But we also, that by this modal shift, you have your greenhouse emission reductions, and you also enhance logistics and efficiency. So putting it all together, when we're thinking about efficiency, resiliency, private and public investments, it has to be like a combination of all these different factors that, make the system more reliable and better. Chuck?
Yeah, well, as I'll do probably repeatedly, I endorse pretty much everything Luisa just said there. That all makes a lot of sense. And she's one of the big minds in rail. When I think about sort of what does resiliency mean in rail, there's in rail, and then there's the slightly bigger picture. And so I'll start with slightly bigger. One of the things that I think is key to understand about rail is, trucking is the dominant mode of freight transportation in this country. So I would say, for better or for worse, that is just true. And it's been true for many, many decades now. So I would say rail itself is a huge contributor to resiliency and flexibility in the network. And we need to, I think, as a country, and obviously I'm naturally biased by my job, but I think as a country, it's important to focus on making sure the freight rail network remains viable and thriving. And we'll get into this, but there are huge public benefits for moving more freight by rail. And a lot of them are kind of common sense, but I'd say it's important to just kind of hit them briefly, right? There is, anytime you can remove freight from highway to rail, you're saving significant taxpayer dollars at first, because it is really the trucks that damage the highway significantly. I think the most recent physics study I read on this said the average truck would cause 9,600 times as much damage as the average passenger car to a highway. And it's really to the extent, and boy, there are a lot of like DOT experts on this call. There's many people on this webinar, just when I look on the list, who know more than I do about this. I saw Alan Rudder's name on here, Steve Dittmeyer. But there are, when you design highways, they don't even consider passenger cars, right? The damage to highways is all trucks, and it's all about axle load. So when you can move freight off of the highway onto the rail, you're saving a huge amount of taxpayer funds. You're reducing congestion on the highway, which is good for freight capacity. It's also just good for people. Literally nobody wants to be on a highway next to a truck. It's like the one comment I could make that has 100% approval rating. There's also huge safety benefits. And look, rail is not perfect on safety. Certainly anybody who thinks about freight rail still thinks about East Palestine 2.5 years later. And so we are not perfect on safety. We have some problems at grade crossings and trespassings, but we are far, far safer way to move freight than the alternative. It is 3 to 20 times safer, depending on whether you're measuring equipment damage or injuries or fatalities, but it is the safest way to move freight over land. And there are also, as Luisa hinted at, there are huge environmental benefits. We obviously are aware of the shift in tone from Washington, D.C., and, green and environmental is not quite the hot topic today that it is, was 2 years ago, but it is still, this is nothing if not a long game. We've been freight railroading in the United States for 198 years. We're coming up on our 200th birthday party in 2027. And we will continue to talk about this no matter what's happening with changes in administration. Freight rail is the cleanest way to move freight over land, and it's a big reduction in emissions. And so all of those, benefits come along with the resiliency benefit of investing in rail.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And so before I go any further, I actually just want to point out to the audience that on that kind of Zoom feature, there is a Q&A button. So as we go through this conversation, feel free to open up that Q&A box, type in your questions as we go. And then once Henry and I open it up to everyone, then we can kind of run through and see which questions we want. So go ahead and start populating that with your questions as they come up. And Henry, if I see your hand is raised, if you want to go ahead and contribute, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the protocol is for a moderator to put his hand up, but I feel compelled to ask a question to everybody, including myself, which is, I believe that most of the people on this webinar are understanding of the environmental benefits, the safety benefits, et cetera, of rail. But if you look at rail market share, we struggle to maintain our market share. And the good news is we're doing better than Europe. So anybody on this webinar who is asking how your European train vacation can translate to US transportation policy, this is the wrong crowd. But to Chuck and Luisa, how is it that if everybody knows we're the nicest, most environmentally friendly, socially responsible driver of economic development, why is our market share flat? And if so, what should we be doing about it? We being policymakers, transportation companies, and even the customer. Thank you.
Yeah, it is a huge source of frustration, right, to not only people in the industry like ourselves, but also I think a fair number of people who pay attention on the public policy front. But the rail market share has not grown it's flat, volume is basically flat line. So that means market share has slowly shrunk over the last, call it 15 years. And that's obviously a negative for railroads, but it's maybe more importantly a negative for society. There's plenty of blame that I think we own ourselves. And then I think that there's maybe some blame that public policy holds, and more importantly, kind of ways to fix it going forward. Railroads themselves, I think, need to, boy, that's a long list. I'll highlight the top two, right? One is it is unnecessarily difficult and too difficult to use rail as a customer. It is extraordinarily easy to book a truck and move freight that way. Whereas to move rail, it's like you need special infrastructure, you need special rail cars, you need to know a special vocabulary. You can't just kind of go online and just like sign up and book it. There's phone calls, there's credit checks, there's like it does, for people who use it, it tends to be extraordinarily sticky because you can move it in huge capacity and typically significantly less expensive than truck, but we make it too hard to use. And so I think we need to get better on that as an industry. And, like we can't even tell every customer where each one of their rail cars is at all time, that's a little embarrassing, but there's things we're doing as an industry like Rail Pulse to get better at that. But there's also, a very big picture, and we ignore this on a daily basis. But again, trucking is the big competitor here. The gas tax hasn't been increased since 1993, and the Highway Trust Fund went negative, as they would call it, in 2008. And obviously Jeff Davis with Eno is one of the world's great experts on this topic. But so we've been shoveling general fund money into the Highway Trust Fund at a federal level for 17 years and counting now. And the tally on that is $275 billion with a B, $275 billion and counting. So that is money from the public, even from railroads, because we pay taxes, we're private companies, that going into the general fund and then going as a subsidy to our biggest competitor. And so that is an awfully steep mountain to climb, or a tide sort of swimming against us. So I think, if I were starting with public policy, that would be the biggest change. And there are a lot more details we can get into, for short lines, Chrissy grants, 45G, there's truck size and weight issues, there's regulatory issues at FRA and STB. But, I would say that is the biggest one, is there is just a huge and ongoing subsidy of the trucking industry happening every year that makes it awfully tough to swim against that tide.
And just to add a little bit to what Chuck was saying, is the reason why, this becomes a sticking point is the railroads are privately owned. We maintain, we build, and we continuously invest in that network, whereas our trucking partners they are not responsible for maintaining, building the infrastructure. So it does become, a challenge. But also it's the type of commodities that the railroads move. When you think about the top 3 commodities in the United States by carload, you have coal, grain, and chemicals that move vast distances. The coal and the grains are generally unit trains that, you're not going to be putting that into trucks. So we're pretty much stuck on that. Coal has been declining because of competitive natural gas prices. Chemicals at least have been increasing, but the other area that has been slowly increasing just a little bit is intermodal, in terms of, the movement of goods and whatnot by, ship, rail, truck. But they, a while back, and I would say like maybe about 10, 15 years ago, we used to see a lot of trailers, like literally with a chassis on top of a flat car on a train. Whereas now that particular share has been declining consistently. So now you see, I think last time I checked the AR numbers, the share of intermodal was 92% without chassis, and 2%. 92 was without chassis, just the container itself, and the 2% was, or the 8% was with the trailers. So there's a lot of challenges there. I think regulatory challenge is the regulatory aspect is, it's a huge hurdle. And that requires a lot of modernization. And do you want to add anything to that?
I would just dive in and say that as I hear both Chuck and Luisa talking here and looking at the Q&A, there's a follow-on question which I'd like to ask, which is, do you think that our industry would benefit more from a top-down national policy approach or a bottoms-up localized approach? And that refers to both to a small extent regulation, but more importantly, how infrastructure funding is distributed. And I realize it's a pretty broad question, but I'm guessing that each of you will answer them in completely different ways.
Perhaps, I mean, I'm not sure. I think I'll resist the temptation to choose and sort of point out that both are crucial in freight rail policy and probably need to be. But there is, I would say on a regulatory side, the appropriate regulatory structure for rail belongs at the federal level. And, it's a national network that doesn't really pay much attention to state boundaries and would be difficult, if not impossible, to imagine operating a national freight rail system with 49 different regulatory systems. And in fact, it's so much so that one of our big requests at the federal level is for the Surface Transportation Board to be more proactive and aggressive in asserting preemption so that we, in fact, don't have to deal with sort of an impossible patchwork of 49 different state regulatory schemes. But on the funding and planning and support level, I'd really say it has to happen at both. The good news is some of that happens. There is a reasonable amount of freight rail, CRISI is sort of the federal freight rail program that is of most interest to short lines. There's also the Rail Crossing Elimination Program, which provides some federal support. There's also the Build grant program, which a lot of people are familiar with. I do think there'd be an opportunity for that to be can take rail more into account. I think it's been pretty focused on other modes like highway and transit and pedestrian and bike, and I'd like to see rail be more competitive on that. There's also quite a few states, Pennsylvania, New York, Illinois, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Virginia, Washington, Oregon, that have state grant programs. And I apologize if you're a state DOT and I left you out there. There's more. They tend to be very, very small. You get like $1 million here, $5 million there, which doesn't change the world when you're talking about rail infrastructure, but they're much quicker and they're very useful. I would say if I had a criticism to offer or a point for suggestion, the state rail programs still tend to be pretty siloed from the kind of the rest of the state DOT. And I would say there is a huge opportunity for rail to be much more considered at the state freight planning level. And that can be just as powerful as, as money. And there's a sort of a huge opportunity for improvement there. And there's a similar analogy on the tax side. There's a federal tax program that is very effective for short lines, 45G. There are also 11 states now that have a state version of a short line railroad tax credit, like a state 45G. But that means there's 38 other states, not counting Hawaii, where we don't have freight rail, but there's 38 other states that don't have that yet. And I'd also submit that would be a very powerful and effective mechanism to help support rail infrastructure.
And as Henry predicted, I'm going to answer completely different from Chuck's perspective. So I was pondering over this particular question. I want to bring, together the modal shift, the investments in regulation, modernizing regulation. So one of the things that is super important and becomes the kind of the unsung hero is technology. Like technology is advancing super, super fast, and our regulations are not keeping up with these changes. So one of the examples is that I can provide you is that, again, some of the regulations are kind of outdated and whatnot. And, for the CM perspective, one of the things that we've done is autonomous tracked inspections. So essentially we have, 10 cars just running at full speed, and they're analyzing essentially the health of the track. And we're able to obtain, basically live data on the state of our track, and we can proactively, update our maintenance and capital planning. But yet, currently, the current regulation is visual inspection mandates. So essentially, you have to have a chunk of your track closed for an extended period of time, and you have some folks going with flashlights doing visual inspections. And it requires say twice weekly manual checks. Now, just imagine, for those of you who work here in Washington, D.C., if we were to close 395 for 2 hours, and we have folks walking up and down 395, looking at the, for potential maintenance deficiencies and whatnot, that wouldn't work, right? So when we have to close the track, that essentially prevents for us to keep moving the freight movement. So this is like a prime example where modernization of regulation would be great, because we're able to implement some of these technologies that, we can invest in this additional technology. We can continue moving freight. It goes towards our resiliency, preventing maintenance. And also, we're training all these employees to not only they're becoming the finders, become the fixers too. So I think that was again, completely different approach from Chuck, but it gives you a different perspective of how these three things connect with each other.
That is actually, that's a really good answer. And I think it ties to, I think, a couple of questions here that actually we've got in the chat about the kind of overly prescriptive federal regulations. And I think that it also, the question about technology, Luisa, I think also in my head, it reminds me of something that you guys were talking about earlier, which is how the kind of infrastructure investments needed to improve efficiency and resiliency and make rail more competitive, a lot of that is falling on the private railroads, right? You guys are the ones that are actually making the investments and actually doing the construction. And so I want to kind of have you guys dive more into these challenges of making rail that kind of more attractive mode for customers, where, what are the kinds of infrastructure solutions in addition to these technology improvements that are actually going to make rail that much more competitive for customers compared to trucking, right? Because I think, Chuck, that you talked about, how it is very hard to get that kind of last mile, right, to customers, where trucking kind of dominates that space. Is there an opportunity there for rail to be more competitive?
Yeah, for rail infrastructure investments, there's sort of a lot of ways to think about it. There is maybe the most useful rubric, right, is there is a huge amount of rail infrastructure investment that looks like basic maintenance, right? Like there is a 140,000-mile network of track, ballast, ties, bridges, and setting aside all the rolling stock that just has to be maintained. And it's an expensive job, and the railroad, the class ones do it all with their own funds, and they're all Fortune, all the class ones are Fortune 500 companies. And I think the industry takes a huge amount of pride, and we do it ourselves, and we keep it in great shape. And it is probably the shining star of US infrastructure, right? Because it is kept in, frankly, pretty good shape. The short lines largely do it on their own, but we occasionally get some bits of public help, through 45G and Chrissy. But then there's the kind of the more exciting investments, like how do we make it better, which is sort of what you're getting at. And there's the kind of one way to think about that is the capacity and kind of the special, there's choke points, right? Where can we solve, areas where you go slow, right? Like one of the famous lines in railroading is like, the best way to go fast is to not go slow, right? So you don't really have to worry about going 50 miles per hour versus 40 miles per hour, but you want to make sure you don't go 5 miles per hour instead of 20 miles per hour, right? So you can focus on choke points. And then you can also use signaling investments to, to enhance capacity without having to build new track and get new land, which is difficult to get. But then, maybe on the most exciting side, and this is maybe most of what you were getting at, Sahil, with the first mile, last mile, and the between different modes, there's also rail can only serve directly the customers that are directly online, which is an unfortunately quite small subset of American business and manufacturing, but everybody else is not that far away. So the two ways we get their freight onto rail is transload or intermodal, right? And I think most people know what intermodal is, right? That's the container that can go right from the truck to the train and back and forth. And short lines aren't a huge part of that business, although Henry's Railroad for sure is. But that's generally a Class 1 dominated business and is a huge growth area. But then transload is you basically take the stuff out of a truck and you put it into a train, or out of a train and put it into a truck. And I would say of the 603 short line railroads in the United States, probably 601 of them are focused on transload as a way to grow. And so there are investments that absolutely can and should be happening at transload sites and transload technology to get more and more freight off of the road onto rail. And by doing transload, that makes the potential market share essentially 100%. I mean, there's nothing can't be put on train.
To add to that, I mean, what Chuck was saying about the transload, that was the example that I provided you earlier, that, essentially we build this transload facility. So instead of, we're working with a short line, we also work these steel coils when them from truck to rail. So that is one example, but also, what he was saying about, Chuck was saying about the choke points. One of the investments that CN made is they purchased the EJE in Chicago. And I'm sure all of you know that Chicago is, the heart of rail, and there's huge choke points there. So one of the, with the purchase of the Ellen, Joliet, and Eastern Railroad, a small short line, you can actually bypass the congestion within Chicago. And that turned out really great for us. And that was one of those things that is like, how can we make it more attractive? Is the way that you can get your product much faster, and you miss out on this congestion in Chicago. So transloading, 100%, I agree with that. These partnerships with the short lines are critical, and this is why we work so closely with Chuck and the short lines, and we kind of continue maintaining these relationships because they're critical to help us get there to the first mile and the last mile.
Henry, go ahead.
Okay, so looking at the questions, I think a number of them have come up with the implication that, and I'll try to put this in one sentence, and I'm not going to say that I agree with this, but I'm going to synthesize what I think I read. Class 1 railroads are all owned by Wall Street, which is short-term focus, and how do you align that with the broader decentralized economic benefits of increasing market share and economic development at the local level? Now, a couple footnotes. Of the 6 Class 1 railroads, one is privately held, BNSF, and I'm guessing this is a softball question, at least for the short line railroads, because most short line railroads are not beholden to Wall Street for short-term results. But how do you square off the two? Because as we've discussed already, most rail traffic involves at least 2 railroads, many times 3, and almost always a Class 1.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm going to say it's a fair criticism. Obviously, I work for short lines. I think that there's an aspect of this that the rail industry could do better. And then again, I think there's an aspect of public policy, right? And I'm not a starry-eyed idealist. I don't think people are going to stop worrying about share prices or money or profit margin just because people outside of the industry say, please don't worry about that stuff anymore. Like that's just not how the world works. But I personally think, and most short lines I think would agree with this, certainly in the hallways after a drink, but and maybe publicly too. I think the rail industry has shot itself in the foot a little bit over the last decade or so on an over focus on profit margin as opposed to volume and revenue growth. And I think, like diving right into the third rail of pricing, I think there's traffic that freight railroad industry misses out on because we're collectively too focused on keeping an attractive margin when we ought to be more focused on growing volume and making money that way. And so I think we've kind of hurt ourselves. But I also think there's a public policy angle. And again, at the risk of repeating myself, when you're competing against a heavily subsidized network, right? We're competing against the trucking industry, $250 billion and counting of public subsidy, not to mention the subsidy that happens when a car pays the gas tax and subsidizes the highway that's really getting beat up by the truck, not by the individual car. We're subsidizing our competitor every day. And then we also, we have public policy that makes it easier for trucks to innovate than rail. Automation is a fabulous example. Everyone seems to be excited about autonomous cars and autonomous trucks, and the DOT has a steady stream of announcements about how we can help autonomous trucks. But what do we get on that front on the rail side? Well, we have a 2-person crew rule from the federal government that not only doesn't sort of think about helping autonomous trains, but wants to lock in, at least for the Class 1 railroads, wants to lock in 2 people in the cab of a locomotive for all eternity. And so to me, that's a pretty big dichotomy. There are some fun exceptions to that, like Parallel Systems and Intramotive are 2 really exciting technology companies that are trying out on a very small scale so far with kind of waivers, checking out autonomous movements. But, Parallel, like, boy, they had to struggle to get a waiver to try this out on 2 small short lines in Georgia with every safety precaution you can possibly imagine. And our labor friends are still sort of pushing back against that. So I think we need to make sure that, while there's plenty of criticism to go around on rail industry executives, I think we also need to make sure the public policy environment is supportive of growing by rail.
I don't really have much to add to that, except that, it's a really delicate dance between, our responsibility or our duty with our shareholders. And we have to be able to attract investment to continue growing our investing in our network and whatnot. But it's also, we need to make sure that we continue serving our customers and providing the service that they need, that we make the enhancements that we need, that we implement the technology to continue moving the train safely, efficiently, and whatnot. So I think it's a combination of both of them, and it is a very, very delicate dance.
Go ahead, Henry.
If I could presume to make myself a panelist for just 1 minute and to riff on what Chuck said, for those of you who still want to gauge our U.S. rail system based on your European vacations, keep in mind that in addition to serving as the chairman of a Class 2 railroad in the USA, I also serve as chairman of a freight railroad in France. And the problem there is, of course, toy trains competing with monster trucks. The reason I bring this up is because one of the many policy things that has come up in the last 5 years is, how many people do you need on a train? And not many people appreciate this, but in France, the freight trains have always run with 1 person. And that's the way the government railway has always run. So if you look on French railways as the paragon of everything, keep in mind what French railways, even back to state railway times, have had to do to compete with monster trucks.
Interesting. I want to kind of maybe shift gears a little bit from the technology discussion, and I want to kind of I want I guess I'm a little confused, I think. So Luisa, you talked about this kind of collaboration between short lines and the class ones. I'm kind of curious if you guys could maybe talk more about that. What are the actual strategies for collaboration between short lines, class ones, between the class ones themselves to improve railroad efficiency, right? Because, you know, from where, as someone who isn't as much of an expert in the rail space, when I look at ones, my perception of them has always been in a more, they're competing with each other, right? You know, to, you know, see, you know, how much, you know, what they're moving, right? And so, but when you guys talk about this in a collaborative sense, that kind of piques my interest in terms of, oh, that sounds like a way for rail to kind of really become this, oh, this is an attractive mode compared to trucking. There's an opportunity to increase how well we can move things and how we can, you know, adapt to like disruptions in the network. So I'm curious to just kind of hear more about those kinds of collaborative efforts.
I can give you a couple of examples. So first, the last thing that you said was about disruptions of the network. And I want to dive in a little bit on extreme weather events. They're becoming more frequent and more damaging, whether it's a fire, a flood, strong winds, you name it, we're ready to take on the challenge. And I think that part of these partnerships is when a weather event happens, it's very likely that you're going to have to reroute your freight, whether it's through a short line or another class one railroad. So we have to make sure that we have these relationships ready because we have to get the freight to get from point A to point B. And sometimes you have to go to point C. And let me just give you two very specific examples, in not only of how we answer to extreme weather, but also when we work with a particular, with a short line. So there was a fire forest fire in Minnesota sometime in May, and basically took out one of our rail lines. So one of the things that, you know, immediately what we needed to do is work with the community, but also alert our partners saying, hey, you know, we got this, you know, these trains that we need to send back to the customer, and just trying to figure out, you know, the schedules, how are we going to do this? Because they have to make adjustments on how they operate the railroad to take on original freight. But the one thing that we ended up doing also, just to protect the assets and help the community, is, you know, we deployed our firefighting locomotive trains. So we have the Trident and the Neptune, which are kind of like a fire truck, but except it's a railroad. And they were deployed in 2024 because of the increased forest fires. And so essentially now we have that to assist the community when there's a fire. We also had, you know, grinding equipment that sprays water. So that's part of our efforts. But the most important thing here, the one that I want to highlight, is that partnership, because we still have to move freight. And also just to think about when we have a customer that says, hey, you know, I have this, you know, without the extreme weather example, we have this widget that we want to get to, say, Texas. Well, CN doesn't have a track to Texas. So when you have like all these relationships, you can highlight, hey, listen, we can get your freight if, you know, because we're going to be working with A, B, C, and D. And that kind of helps them, you know, kind of visualize how they're going to get from, you know, from one point to another. And again, it's all about the relationships that you build, that they're essential, but that also keeps us competitive.
Yeah, I mean, the very nature of short lines, right, is somewhere close to 100% of our traffic has to connect to a class one. There's almost no traffic that starts and stops on a short line. It's vanishingly rare. So the entire business model depends on handoffs to class one railroads, right? So by the nature, like literally every day, every move, every hour is a partnership, right? And so I would submit it is one of the great kind of like win-win partnerships in American transportation and in railroading, right? You've got the short line in this kind of small local area. The president of the railroad lives there. You know, she's got a couple marketing people under her, and they knock on every door in the neighborhood. They do all the heavy lifting. They sponsor the Little League team. They join the Rotary Club. They're at the Chamber of Commerce meetings. They know what plot of land is what. They gather up all the traffic. You know, they get it. They do all the kind of the high touch switching, pickups, drop-offs, and then they gather it in a train and bring it to the interchange place and hand it to the class one. And then the class one does what they do better than any other freight railroad network on earth and move large quantities of stuff kind of long distances reliably and pretty cheaply. And it is a pretty fantastic partnership. And to me, you know, at the risk of being a simpleton, like more of that would be really good. So they work together every day, you know, to do that. And that's, you know, that's a technology partnership, but it's also just like, it's also still just phone calls and radio and texts and emails to each other. It's not always kind of rocket science, even though we do have former rocket scientists, you know, at Parallel Systems working on cool technology stuff. I would also, you know, I do want to highlight the Rail Pulse system, which is a partnership of a few of the biggest class ones and a few meaningful short lines who are trying to outfit not just every locomotive, but every rail car in the country with GPS, but also asset health monitors. Like, is the door open or closed? What's the temperature inside? What's the temperature on a wheel bearing? Shout out East Palestine. Has there been a collision? You know, what, like all this kind of asset health monitoring. And I think one day when that's everywhere, that will really transform how freight railroading works. And so I think there's an opportunity for all of the railroads to double and triple down on what's kind of, to me, obviously a great idea and go a lot faster. And also an opportunity for our friends at the federal level to help. That was kicked off by a small Christie grant a few years ago, but there hasn't been any additional federal investment since. And I think it's an opportunity for the feds to jumpstart that. And, you know, look, the class ones don't need the money, right? Like they don't say they need the money, but there is an opportunity for public investment to come in and try to accelerate things, you know, and say like, hey, look, there's public benefits to that. So we are coming in as a push to help make this go faster and tell everybody that the public supports this getting done. So I think that's an exciting opportunity.
Henry, go ahead.
Yeah, so keeping an eye on the chat, as well as the theme that you raised, Sohail, about resiliency, I'd like to make a point, which there are two things which we do, which are more or less purely market-based as opposed to regulatory-based, and that is cooperation. And to a certain extent, resiliency. We have to cooperate because the truck is the regulator. The truck sets the price and the service. And if we don't come up with something which is competitive with that, we, the 3 or 4 railroads involved in most hauls, don't get any of the business. So it's not like you have a top-down prescriptive thing that can be done to make us more user-friendly. We are motivated by the marketplace just to survive by being user-friendly. But the other thing is resiliency. So one thing you need to know is that our railroad, the Iowa Interstate, runs from Chicago to Omaha, which is one of 4 railroads that runs from Chicago to Omaha. There used to be 7. So why would you need a 4th railroad from Chicago to Omaha? You know, all the central planners said the railroad deserved to go away. And in fact, it was abandoned from 1980 to 1984. But it was the marketplace that put it back together, because it wasn't traffic moving from Chicago to Omaha. It was all the communities in the middle that not only had the demand for transportation, but in some cases really put their money where their mouth was in terms of funding the original group of shareholders that owned the railroad. So yeah, the marketplace makes us try to be as user-friendly as possible. And yeah, in some case, the marketplace provides resiliency. The Iowa Interstate existing provides resiliency. But to Chuck's point, you know, some of the stuff we don't get paid for. Resiliency, you know, you don't build a church for Sundays. There is a public benefit to having resiliency, and that is arguably a good use of public funds to have, even if it's a plan B, railroads. And you know where that's playing out even as we speak? Europe. where all of a sudden people have realized that NATO is lacking in terms of the ability to use rail for a conflict. Well, the war in Ukraine, that's Russian railways versus Ukraine railways, because military campaigns are based on logistics. So could everybody please give me a gold star for taking a single set of themes and going on as many rabbit holes as possible without getting cut off by the other moderator? Thank you.
Gold star.
Well, yeah, well done. That was, but honestly, that was, I think it wasn't that far off. I think that it has a lot to do with this kind of emergency preparedness planning. Like, how are railroads, thinking about being proactive about, disruptions in the network? And I think that there's a balance there, right? Like, how much can you plan? How much can you build before it becomes like too much infrastructure, right? As a private company, there's only so much. If you're building all these rail lines and it's not being utilized, just saying that, oh, well, we're being prepared for a disruption in the future, I don't know if that I'm guessing that there's a balance there between justifying how much we build and how much we're prepared. So actually, I want to know if, I want you guys to maybe talk more about that. Like, what does that proactive planning look like? And how do you guys balance that as, in the rail sector?
Yeah, there's a couple different aspects of that, which are all sort of fun and unique. One is the infrastructure itself, right? So there's things railroads can do and do kind of regularly do to make sure they're resilient, right? One of them is just raising the track a little bit, like a couple feet can make a huge difference in a high water event. Another is making sure that your drainage and your ballast is in great shape. Ballast is sort of the, like, for the engineering nerds on this webinar, ballast is kind of the unsung hero of like how the entire rail network works. Not only does it keep the track stable, but it also is key for drainage and allowing railroads to function in, floods and high water events. Another is sort of like planning, like if there's going to be a flood, get your locomotives to high ground, right? So there's things the railroads can do on their own, but on the planning front, a lot of it is just communication and relationships and kind of tabletop planning. Sadly or frustratingly, or just like in our reality, like that is a community by community, railroad by railroad kind of grinded out thing. Like, and not that it's painful, but like that's a lot of phone calls, it's a lot of relationships, it's a lot of meetings, all to prepare for something that hardly ever happens, but you have to do it. That's maybe a little easier for a short line that's in 2 or 3 or 4 communities or 20 communities, maybe like Henry's. Easier for a short line than it is for CN, which is in, I don't know what, like 1,000 communities, 2,000 communities. But nonetheless, those relationships are crucial to do. And then, one of the fun things kind of where the resilience can really play out in a way that's like exciting for people is railroads can be incredibly quick to rebuild after a wipeout. And maybe the most famous story in modern railroading is Hurricane Katrina, but there were highways that were out for months after Hurricane Katrina, but the main rail line over Lake Pontchartrain was wiped out on Tuesday and was getting lifted up by cranes back onto that bridge by Friday. And it was functional and moving trains within like less than a week and a half. And so, and there's still, you can go find online like this amazing kind of ballet of dozens of trains picking up the track out of the bottom of the lake and putting it back on. And so there is a certain magic to private companies being able to motivate and organize extraordinarily quickly at a time of crisis in a way that, the government, even with all of its resources, probably could never match just for speed and nimbleness. So that's something we're real proud of in railroading and kind of a aspect of how we can help with resiliency.
I think Chuck hit the nail on the head. I mean, but we have the ability to respond to disasters very quickly, whether it's a flood, a fire, and whatnot. I mean, you don't hear every day that Triton and Neptune are coming to the rescue to put a fire out, correct? But it's when we think about all the different, not choke points, but potential, issues, you have also, the technology, like you have to stay ahead of, the maintenance of your track. You also have to inspect, you have to cut, trim trees. So if there's a very strong wind or whatnot, to make sure that the tracks are nice and clear. So you kind of have to stay on top of the game and preparing for all the potential ifs with a balance, because we have to protect also the communities that we live in and, all that, protect our assets and whatnot. But it is using all the tools that we have, working with all these different government agencies to understand what are the potential risks in certain areas and make sure that we're ready and able to kind of tackle whatever problem comes to play and continue being resilient.
That's a remarkable thing. Like just the fact that, rail can be so much more adaptive and kind of bounce back from a disruption seemingly more quickly than highways can. And I think that, very much is a great tie into that conversation in mode shift where, maybe trucking can't kind of bounce back, but rail can. And so kind of given that, we have about 4 minutes left. And so I want to round out the conversation with this last question from the chat, which is, how do all of these actors, states, the federal government, private railroads, associations, how do they prioritize mode shift? If that's something that, okay, we've established that rail is this competitive mode, it's resilient, it's efficient, it can bounce back from disruptions. What are the different priorities how do we prioritize, right? And how do we do that at the federal, state, local, private level?
Yeah, I mean, I'll, at the risk of being a little bit repetitive of, of some of the things I mentioned earlier, there's not a magic bullet, obviously. Like, there's an awful lot of smart people on this webinar and in this industry. And if there was a super simple answer to that, I would like to think we would have done it by now. I think it's probably a collection of quite a few things. Again, I would point to maybe the biggest thing is we ought to stop the massive $20+ billion a year and counting subsidy of our biggest competitor. That would go a long way towards, helping with mode shift and just allow people to compete more on an even playing field. If we're not going to do that, you can also go the other way of just more public support of freight rail. Again, the class ones don't ask for that directly, but the short lines are, we're happy to ask Chrissy grants and 45G. And, I think those things could be supercharged and done more at the federal level and the state level. And then I'd also say you got to keep reasonable regulations, right? Like the support of all autonomous trucks versus the 2-person crew mandate is maybe just like the most offensive example. So it's the one we bring up, but there are a lot of rail regulations. Like Title 49 is a stack about yay high, and it's part 213 track safety and part 214 roadway worker and part 220 and conductor certification and engineering certification and minimum training standards. Like, we have a federal rule that tells us how we have to train people to meet all the other federal rules. That's the part 243 minimum training standards rule. And so I think we just have to be careful about, regulating this industry into oblivion. Like, it can't be painful to do anything, innovative or new all the time. The journey Parallel had to take to get this waiver to test out like their technology on one small short line in Georgia is a great example. And then I mentioned earlier, the STB on the regulatory front could be a little helpful in being a little more prominent and proactive in asserting federal preemption. So at least we only have to deal with federal regulations as opposed to 49 different state regulations and coastal commissions and, whatever district wants to come up with a new idea about blocked crossings or train length or train speed or hazmat or emissions or noise or whatever. It's like, at some level, the threat is to make it impossible to run a railroad.
And I just want to add to that it's important to have regulations that are not overly prescriptive, but they're also data driven. And, the prime example is, with technology evolving so much, the standards that we have now might not be there in 5 years. So if a particular regulation gets developed based on the current technological standards, once we get there 5 years later, it's like, bam, this one is outdated. What are we going to do? So all things have to be, evolving and whatnot. So the modernization of regulations cannot be overly prescriptive.
In the interest of time, I know, Henry, you have your hand up, but we are at 1 o'clock. I will give you 30 seconds just to quickly finish this off, and then I think we'll have to finish it there.
Okay. Modal shift by order of the Kremlin does not work. Modal shift by building up customer by customer does. Listen to the customer and figure out ways that customers will want to use rail. Thank you.
That is perfect. And so with that concludes our webinar. Thank you both. Thank you, all three of you, actually, for participating, providing your insights. You all have brought and continue to bring an amazing amount of expertise in the rail space. And so I very much appreciate it. For just some logistics at the end here, the webinar link recording will be posted on our website, enotrans.org. For those who want to listen afterwards, that'll be up there for people to see. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions that people might have. And also don't forget to our audience to subscribe to ETW, check out all of Eno's resources. We have a wealth of information out there on transportation, not just rail issues, right? All kinds of transportation issues. And of course, keep a lookout for any and all upcoming webinars. And thank you all very much for attending. And that concludes our webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.